Thank you for coming back and staying with us for part two, Ms. McCall, Jamie, for your friends. What I think the students would like to know is we've been talking about the history, we talked about the process, we talked about the stakeholders, and we're about to move into making the IEP or assembling the people to write the IEP. So can you talk to them a little bit about what happens when all the assessments come back and we've got that meeting, that first initial meeting where we're sitting down and we're talking about the assessment with the parent. You've got the school psychologist in there to translate, because that was part of our today's lesson, is that they have to be there to translate those results. So can you tell them a little about that meeting and maybe talk to them about some really great meetings and ones that might have went astray?
Okay, so first of all, before you ever have that meeting, it is very likely that the school psychologist is going to call the parent in advance and talk through the results.
Okay.
So that the parent comes to the table with an understanding of what those results are and what they mean. So the day of the IEP comes, you must have somebody at the table that can translate the results. That's either going to be your school psychologist who gave the test, or it could also be your building principal if your building principal has the capacity to explain what the tests mean. But somebody has to be there. Usually it's going to be your school psychologist. You must have a building administrator present, someone who can allocate resources. You must have a general education teacher present, and you must have a special education teacher present, and the parent has to be there and be represented. Okay. So the meeting starts with the administrator starting, just saying what the purpose of the meeting is. And then you go to the school psychologist. The school psychologist explains what the concerns were, what tests were given, which has all been covered in that read meeting already, and then starts talking about the results and what implications those results might have on day-to-day learning. Okay. Then the team, so the evaluation team, which is comprised of probably a school psychologist, maybe a speech therapist, maybe an OT, would say, does the child meet the threshold for special education? They're looking for two things. One, does the child have a qualifying condition? So it has to fit into one of the conditions that your state recognizes, whether that be otherwise health impaired, cognitively impaired, speech and language impairment, severe learning disability. There are usually about 13 categories. That's how many Michigan has anyway. If the child meets that qualifying condition, the second prong of qualifying for special education is the student has to have a need for specialized instruction. Okay, so an example of when that wouldn't be the case. The child might have a condition like otherwise health impaired, so attention deficit disorder, but doesn't need specialized instruction, might only need accommodations. That would take you down the route of a 504 rather than special education. Okay, the same with like a hearing impairment. If the student wears hearing aids and therefore it mitigates the condition of the hearing impairment, and so the child needs no specialized instruction, then the child doesn't qualify for special education. Okay. Do you have any questions?
I used if they're missing an arm or a leg, that they would definitely have a 504 in that, because we've got to make sure they have access, but not necessarily impact their education adversely. So I thought, I was waiting to see which one you grabbed hold of. I thought, I wonder if she's going to use that, because that one to me is so stark. Like, there's going to be some things that we need to help them access, but it doesn't necessarily impact their education. So that is one of the things that they've been studying. And I think that's really good to point out, that ADHD would be another example, that you may have accommodations and not necessarily have the need for specialized ed, because there's no adverse impact to their education. So tell me about a time when you needed all your skills when the parents came to a meeting, was there ever a time where the parents were upset with the results, or believed that they shouldn't be in special ed, or believed that they should, when you had the opposite outcome?
Do you want me to finish that IEP process
Sure,
first?
tell us about that. Yeah.
Okay, so
Sorry, I didn't mean to
after-
interrupt you.
That's okay. After we've determined that the student does need specialized instruction and has a qualifying condition, now we have to look at the student's present level of performance. Where are they? What's going on? How far is it away from where they should be? And we write goals, and those goals have to have measures. How are we going to measure when they're making growth? And then we determine what services do we need to provide in order to help them make that growth, right? That really is about an IEP. And those things, I put it in a pretty simplistic form, but writing an IEP is not that difficult. If you think about what does the child need, how are we going to meet those needs, and how are we going to measure that we've met them? And then how much time is it going to take us? So
Yeah, and if you start with, how do we know that they have anything? Yeah, how do you know?
Yeah, so standardized process. Okay. The next thing, an IEP that's been difficult. So I knew as a building principal when I ran IEPs that anytime I'm going to discontinue a child from needing special education service, those are typically more difficult IEPs. Okay. Especially if the student is a student that has like an ASD label, autism spectrum disorder label. Here's why it was the most difficult. One, because the parent wants as much support for their child as they can have. And the second, when it comes into like multiple categories of disability, parents get Social Security income based on a child's qualifying condition.
So put that in the factor. Yeah.
So that factors in because it's a financial penalty for our parents, right? So typically on those occasions, I would bring small cupcakes to celebrate our successes. And knowing that not everyone was celebrating at the table.
So what happens when you get to the end and the district has one answer and the parents have the other? Have you ever had to go into mitigation? We talked about mitigation a little bit.
Yep. So the district has an obligation to offer what they call free appropriate public education. You've probably heard of that.
Oh my goodness, have they heard of it? They've had to write about FAPE.
The district administrator determines what that is when there's a disagreement. So there have been many times when at the table there is a disagreement as to what the student will receive or will not receive. The district administrator makes the final offer of FAPE. It's why it's always really important to be a good listener in those sessions so that you can say, I heard this, I heard this, I heard this. Here's the district's offer of FAPE. Now, the parent may not sign that, and that's okay. They might request mediation. That's okay. You go to mediation, and a mediator can only look at process and
Who's
try
a mediator in that respect? Who would that be?
The state typically will provide one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the typically what will happen in that situation is the parent will ask for independent evaluations. The district has an obligation to pay for them if the district believes there's been an error or the district believes that having a second opinion might be of help. They only have to pay for one per year, and it has to be a standard fee.
Okay.
So
it's a typical situation. We get into a meeting, we decide that as a district, not you personally, that there's no longer a need for specialized ed. I'm the teacher. I mean, I'm the parent. I say there is. I'd like to have another evaluation, and it would be a typical decision that you would pay for it.
Yeah.
Or would that be atypical?
No, that's typical.
Okay.
Yeah. Most of the time I can think of a few times in my 15 years that I've denied paying for an evaluation, and it's typically after I have already paid for one and then they want another one.
Is that just because it's easier to pay for it because you know the answer is probably going to be the same and you're just looking for the parent to feel better about it and not have to deal with outcomes or like fallout? Or is it because you truly believe a second opinion is what you should look for?
No,
Which-
because the law says they're entitled to that.
Okay,
And
okay.
I look at it as I'm letting them exercise their rights.
okay.
And then we have to, and just know that if I pay for that, I
Mhm.
get the results back,
Okay. So
right?
you
So,
pay for it and you get the results. And that's another
Right.
reason why you might want that.
that's right.
You can read
That's
that
exactly
result
right.
on your own.
And I also get to put in what credentials the person has to have in order to give the evaluation.
Okay.
So it can't be Aunt Susie testing the reading at.
So
and-
here's what, one of the questions that they're gonna have to ask, they're gonna
Mhm.
have to answer from this video, because that's one of their requirements, is why do you think that would be a district's position? You know, to go ahead and think that one through. Why would the district be the person that paid for it, given that you had just mentioned that? Because I would like for them to think that through, why that's a good idea, that you get the results, you get to talk about the credential. Why is that a good idea from a district's perspective? So we have about 4 minutes left of part 2. And the one thing that, given I know that I don't think we've really talked about much before, is the transition phase when students are junior and senior and they're transitioning and they have to have that transition plan. Can you tell them a little bit? Because I have some that are working with high school and some that are special ed K to 12. Can you tell them a little bit about that process from your perspective?
I find that that's a really difficult process, to be honest with you, because one, you're looking at transitional skills, but you also are looking at if the student is still going to earn a high school diploma, when do you
Yeah.
fit those transitional skills in?
Right.
You
Right.
know, so do you pull an elective to do that? Do you make sure that they have access? Do they get those transitional skills at a different point in the day or their career? Finding the time in a high school schedule to work on that is difficult.
Mhm.
There are many times when we may say we've worked on transitional skills and it's been embedded into things,
Yeah.
but maybe not to the same degree as what some students need.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. The I work with a lot of CTE programs, and
Yeah.
that's one of their big things, is that
Yeah.
transitional component, because they can access outside resources, like in Illinois, Department of Rehabilitation Services provided financial support. In other areas, a program called STEP will step in and basically coach them through job skills, but it would be what you're saying, is finding that time to send them out to work in a bank. For instance, I knew one student who did that. So now they're not in math class. So what do you do about that? That does make sense. So the last 2 minutes, can you tell me, have you got any kind of advice that you would give these students along the way?
And these are gen ed teachers, special ed
But
teachers,
both,
combination. Okay.
Mhm.
I think the best advice I can give is that when you look at an individual, you work to meet the needs of the individual. And when you are talking to parents about their child, don't talk about the rest of the people in the classroom. They don't care, and it's
Their
irrelevant.
baby. It's their baby, right?
That's right. And I can't tell you how many issues we've had to solve because we've heard a teacher say, I have 25 other students in my classroom. I can't do X, Y, and Z.
Mhm.
And while you may think that, you can never let those words cross your lips in the presence of a parent who needs something for their kids.
Okay. Well, that's actually a good statement that I may make them reflect on and write a little bit about in their essay about your interview with our interview. Well, I have 1 minute and 21 seconds left. So I will say thank you, Ms. McCall, for your time, and I appreciate it. And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh.